Okay, guys. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be learning about romanticism. So, everything you've ever heard about romanticism, I want you to kind of put it in a backplace, okay? Most people, when they think of romanticism, they think of candlelight dinners, walks on the beaches, and all that fun stuff. Um, but in literature, romanticism refers to a particular period. It's a term for a literary movement between the 18th and 19th century in Britain. And the authors focused on emotions. They were rebellious, they were individualistic. So that's the biggest focus with romanticism. So if you think, please, if you see this on a test or anything like that, if it's candlelight dinners, walks on the beaches, all that fun stuff, kind of push it aside because it has nothing to do with that. So, what is romanticism and why should I care? We can't escape it nowadays. Television, internet, ads, movies, everyone is telling us what we should be doing with our lives, what we should want, what we should look like, and what we should feel. Okay. And so, romantics, we're in the same boat. Of course, we want to be rich. Of course, we want to be skinny. Of course, we want to get married and have kids and live in the suburbs, right? For a lot of us, we don't conform to these ideals. And so it gets tiring living in a culture that's always putting pressure on us to conform, to be like other people, to want what everyone else wants. And we begin to question ourselves. Are we weird for not wanting to take that job? For not wanting to dress like that? For not wanting to behave in that way? And the romantics were in the same boat. They were very common with that type of stuff. But their biggest message to us as readers is that you do you. Okay. And so those are some pretty good points to take. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the characteristics of romantic literature. So the first thing that they did is they experimented with poetic form. When you first read romantic poems, they may seem old fashioned because they say things like, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. It sounds fancy, right? To the modern ear, this stuff can seem pretty old school. But actually, the Romantics were groundbreaking in terms of challenging poetic tradition. So what they did is they wanted to revolutionize the way that poetry was written. They were sick and tired of how artsy fartsy poetry had become, especially the poetry of their predecessors. They wanted to make poetry controversial. They wanted to set out and write poems that used the language of ordinary speech, but was still beautiful. And so once again, with their poetry, they are trying to break away from conformity. They're trying what everyone else is doing, they're trying to break away from that. Another characteristic was the emphasis of nature. The Romantics had a huge crush on nature. These guys and gals loved trees, flowers, mountains, clouds, birds, whatever, you name it. As long as it was outdoors, they loved it. That's where Romantics found their inspiration for poetry, wisdom, and straight up happiness. If you went to romantic with the diagnosis of depression, they tell us, forget the meds, take a walk in the park, hug a tree, talk to a bird. All you need is a little green. And so their focus was that nature was very healing. It was very therapeutic, and it was kind of taking you back to your roots. When you go for a walk and you look in the woods and stuff, you see that brush that is wild. It doesn't conform to a set regiment style or anything like that, but it's still beautiful. And so they saw this and they kind of reflected it within their own lives. Part of their obsession with nature also had to do with the fact that they were living and writing in a time of the Industrial Revolution. So in big cities, there were factories springing up everywhere, and you had mechanical machinery processes that were changing society, and people were moving further and further from nature, and they saw this as a negative aspect. So they wanted to remind everyone how good nature could be. And then, of course, they loved ruins and relics of the ancient past. So, basically, anything that was in our past, they loved to kind of like statues, artwork, any of that type of stuff they loved. And so there was kind of always an ode to those types of things. And you see that in a lot of the literature as an ode, where they kind of show how their love for history and the things that came from them. So, and then of course there was the whole idea of rebellion. They weren't conforming to any ideal. They would be the kids in high school who'd wear strange clothes, listen to underground music, and not hang out with anyone else. They're not trying to fit in with the cool crowd. Quite opposite, they sneer at everything that everyone else considers cool or hip because they have their own extremely sophisticated standard of coolness. And so if you were like everyone else, you could be belittled because of that. They wanted to focus on the whole idea of being an individual. So the biggest thing was going against the grain. And you saw this not just in social, literary, and political conventions as well. So, and then of course there was the hero. Everybody has heard of the romantic hero. And what does that mean? It's not your typical hero that's the good guy and yada, yada, yada. The romantic hero does something that maybe society rejects them at first or something like that. They're not the good guy who's good all the way from beginning to end. They have some faults. They're a little different than everyone else. And so you got to think about some of the heroes in the literature. They create larger than life, unforgettable heroes, because they're telling stories about people who rebelled, who fought for their ideas, and who were playing amazing lovers. Okay, they write about characters who stood out from the crowd, and you see that in their literature. Okay, and so it's people who stood out in some way. Your hero is not going to be the good guy and always the good guy. They're doing something different, or they're standing up for their ideas, and maybe society rejects them at first because of their ideal. And then, of course, emotion. They loved emotions. They were very sentimental. They would talk about how a flower could move them to tears. And but the biggest thing is that they focused on was powerful emotions. And a lot of this overlaps with the other ideas, how emotional nature could be, how emotional being an individual could be, and things like that. And so those were the things that they were bringing to the table. And then, of course, Sense and Sensibility. So with this in romantic writing, they use a lot of sensory details. So how you smell, taste, hear, the sights, everything is very descriptive, okay? And so, especially when they're describing nature or something like that, and they're alluding it to your feelings and emotions, they're going to describe it very in depth, okay? And then the whole idea of sublime, okay? So some of you may know Sublime as an old school band, but sublime is this whole idea that you are somewhere in nature, okay? And you have this powerful emotion, and that is where you get to sublime. So think of big mountains, crazy deep valleys, a huge thunderstorm with a lightning strike everywhere. What happens when we are confronted with nature in its grandest is that we are both terrified and uplifted at the same time. It's hard to describe, but oftentimes, I think of how exhilarating it is. Like when I went to the Grand Canyon, okay, you're looking at these massive valleys that are so beautiful and everything like that. But then it's also terrifying because you take one trip and fall and it's your death, okay? And so you have those types of aspects where it brings two strong emotions and you reach them at the same time. And that's what they were getting at with a lot of their literature, of how things aren't one-dimensional. Okay, so while you have this grand thing in nature or something like that, your emotions will take you to this level of sublime because it's the power and the strength of it all, and how terrifying and beautiful it is, and combines it all together. And then, of course, they were focused on the French Revolution. the French Revolution had huge repercussions not only in France but all over Europe. It was the first time that the aristocracy had been brought down, and so people saw that. So it had huge social and political transformations, which sometimes you see in some of their poems. Um, and of course they love the idea of rebellion and being an individual. And then also during romantic literature, the industrial revolution was bringing a lot of changes at the time to romantic poets, when they began writing. And so more and more people were moving from cities to work in factories. New manufacturing processes were being put in place, and people were moving further and further away from nature. And so the Romantics weren't very enthusiastic about these changes. They were especially concerned about people moving away from nature. And so maybe a romantic argument that you could make nowadays is maybe education. You could argue that education is much like a manufacturing plant. People go into first grade, then they process to second grade, then they process to third grade, and then so on and so on and so on, as opposed to being individualistic to meeting each individual kid where they're at. Now, sometimes it's opposites, but you can see where that argument could be made and how that might be more detrimental. So, just some ideas to think about. Because at the end of this week, what you are going to be doing is you're going to be creating a poem of either that's based off of romantic characteristics or Victorian characteristics, and there will be some guidelines with that. So what I would recommend is now I would go ahead and do the discussion thread about how you could apply the characteristics of romantic literature to a song, and give some examples of that before we move on to Victorian, so that way it doesn't overlap. Okay, this week we're going to look at two different movements before we move on. And so that's kind of what I would recommend. Anyways, good luck and stay safe, guys.